I'm recording, so if you wish to make a complaint, you can do it very loudly and then the microphone might pick it up. I have been doing a number of different YouTube videos which some of you may have seen. Gail has put links to on the page. I did one just now which basically goes through the what I'm going to do in this lecture, or hope to do in this lecture. So if you want to fall asleep now and come back sometime later and watch it online, then you can do that. But I'm also recording the lecture I'm actually giving just now, and Gail will put this up after this evening. Now the notes for today's lecture as well are already online, and I'm going to deal with them like this so that I can record them at the same time rather than running them. It gets a bit complicated with my setup here if I allow the thing just to record the whole screen, and life gets a bit difficult for me at times, especially if something goes wrong, which often happens. So although the title of this one is called Code Repositories, it's the beginning of a longer lecture which goes on into next week about designing a project and actually doing it. What I intend to do today, and what I've done in the video that I've shown you, is to have another go at a new game, different game from the one I started on last week. It's going to be a 2D board game. The lecture notes show pictures of yet another game, which I've also done in the past. The previous one was Snakes and Ladders. I like to try and do new things to show you how you can make mistakes, and how it really doesn't matter if you make mistakes, because you so long as you find out why you made the mistake and repair what you've done, then that's what it's all about. It's about getting it right. Software engineering is about getting your code to do what it's supposed to do and still do it every day. Now, I'm a very old man, and as a result, I have what's called grandchildren. Have you got any grandchildren yet? No. Okay. I got married and had children at a very young age, so I'm not as old as it sounds like when I've got grandchildren. One of my grandchildren has just been admitted to hospital. He's less than a week old. He has an infectious disease. It's not coronavirus, all right. He's on antibiotics and they're treating him, and they're hopefully going to let him out today. But while he's in the neonatal unit, one of the experiences he might have had, if anything had gone seriously wrong, would be that he might need resuscitated. And the software that they use to train the people who resuscitate the children in that unit, should anything happen, was designed by me and a group of students that I was in charge of. And it was very important that we get it right. Because if we don't get it right, then the chances that my own grandson will die would be increased. Okay? So I vitally understand how important it is to make sure you get your software development right. It's not something that we're playing around with. Now, even if we're developing a game, that's just a game. If it's something you're going to sell and it's going to be your livelihood, you've got to get it right. Otherwise, you cease to make any money, okay? And if you don't have any money, they won't give you food very easily at the shops, and so you'll end up not very well yourself, okay? It's very important to get it right. And as software engineers, we often get told that we're not proper engineers, because proper engineers would do things with different processes. Well, I want you guys to be able to think about being proper engineering managers, not just hackers. How many people here, not at the back of the class, think of themselves as hackers? How many people at the back of the class have thought of themselves as hackers? I know some of you have. I can see it on your faces. That's the way you learn when you start. When you're a kid, you start to hack, don't you? You start to write code. And if you've not started to learn to program when you're under 9, you can still learn now. All right, it's still possible to learn now, and it's a good thing to just hack. It really is. But, and I don't mean hacking to some space establishment's software. I mean write code just for the fun of it. And Unity is a really brilliant place to start doing that because you can see things happen very quickly. And so it's a good place to learn to program. And the programming language that you can use in Unity is C#. And as I've said before, that's a real serious programming language. It's like the most serious programming languages there are out there in many ways. It works similarly. It's an object-oriented programming language, and it's got capacity to do functional programming as well. So it's really up to date. It's a good language, and so it's worth learning. Play with Unity in your spare time if you've got any. If you don't have any spare time, I'm sorry. Right. So what we're going to do is start a few rules about doing it. I've done a bit of this before. It's been in the lecture notes, and I had fun preparing that video that's online just now. Things went terribly wrong, but fortunately with my video system, I can... So this lecture it's entitled Code Repositories, but it's really about the whole process that we're going to go through. And if we do well, I will introduce the whole idea of storing things on Trello or on any other planned system. And you'll see, I'll show you what I did this morning in getting ready for this lecture. So that doesn't fit on the screen. So one of the purposes of this talk is to emphasize the point of code repositories. And for my first few slides, I'm going to talk about the difference between local and remote copies. So there are two ways of handling code repositories that are generally used. One, it allows for you to make a local copy, and the other allows only to have a remote copy. Now, a local copy is one on your machine, a remote copy is one on some server somewhere, right? And if you have ever used anything called SVN, then that is a remote-only system. The copy of your repository, the final copy, is the only copy, and it's online. It's not on your computer. What you have on your computer is your code that you develop, and when you've finished developing code, you have to put it onto the remote repository with something like SVN. Now, when you have a local copy of the repository, you actually clone the original from, and we call it origin in Git mostly. You clone that origin off the machine that is in the cloud somewhere onto your local machine, and you might make more than one copy of it on your local machine. You can work with it as if it was the same thing as is on the system. You can check out other people's branches. You can do new work on those branches. You can create new code, add it to the branch, commit it locally, check that it all works locally, and then you can push it back to the main or the origin copy. And I said last week that means you can work on the train as you're going down to London, should you have to suffer doing that as part of your work, which I sometimes have to do. You can do other things. You can roll back. You can do merges. And you can do this all on your own computer. So as I said, you can work where there's no internet connection. And if you make mistakes, then you don't disturb other people's work. Yes? Until you sort your own out, you can keep it just locally. But you must regularly, and I keep having to emphasize this, okay? Last year, halfway through the second course, the group coursework, there were still people who were not doing this right. By not pushing your work back, nobody else can develop on your work. Okay, if it's a local repository, it only works on your machine. You need to push it back to the origin machine before anybody else can get a copy on their machine. Right? And if I'm telling you, you must make sure to have an up-to-date version of the thing you are developing of or from. You can't do that if the person who's been working on the other aspect has not pushed. Okay? And so we ended up with people with disparate versions and it not working properly. And it took some time. Now, I doubt that you will not make any mistakes because, as I've just said, I made mistakes today and I've been at this for some years. But try as a group to make sure that you keep the integrity of the system on the main repository. And you do that by regularly pushing back to the origin if you have if you're making developments. Now, it could be that two of you are working on different aspects of the same piece of software, the same thing, and one of you's made a change and have forgotten to communicate with the other one how data is going to be shared between the systems. Yeah? And if that happens, then somebody's put data into a file in one order and somebody else is trying to pull it back with different names. Doesn't work. Yeah? So you've got to keep communicating. And by having problems, the Git system can actually warn you that something's wrong. It can tell you something's wrong, so you can go and make it right. So that's why you've got to do regular pushbacks. Now I'm going to mention different Git repositories in the next few lectures, next few slides. If you like, you can use any one of these three sets of things. There are advantages or disadvantages, and you could, if you wanted to, have your own server and set up your own Git server somewhere. It is possible to do that. It would be very strange, but you could do it. So I'm going to make three suggestions, one of which is the GitLab version, which exists in the School of Computer Science. There is a GitLab version in computer science. You can also set up, as I said, your own server with a GitLab instance on it, but I wouldn't do that if I were you. Now, I can't no longer part of being a full member of staff of the university, I can't sign into this, so I couldn't check whether this thing actually worked this year. And Joe, who maintains it, has changed the names and things in the past. So if one of the undergraduates who's used it recently could tell me, is that the right place? Hello, anybody at the back who's used GitLab? No? Okay, I don't know whether that's the right place. I like using GitHub. There is a big advantage in using GitHub for students. One of those is that employers like to be able to look at work you've done while you're being a student. So, if you have a GitHub repository and you put stuff on your GitHub repository and you make it public, then people outside of the university can look at your work and see what you have done. The other thing you can do is make contributions to open source software. And if you make contributions to open source software that is really good, then outside employers will actually come looking for you, right? But having a GitHub repository that shows you've worked on projects, Gail says the GitLab does work. Okay, good. the GitHub repository that you can make public, and it can be seen by outside people. And that means you can, when you're applying for a job, you can say, I've got some examples of work I did in the team, and it's on GitHub, and you can see how many commits I made and what I did and how useful the piece of software is if you want to. By the way, if other people have worked on your GitHub thing and you want to give it to an employer to look at, you really do need to get their permission to show it to other people. You don't just, you need to get, as a group, decide this is going to be a public repository if that's what you want. Okay? So the world can see your work, and the big advantage of GitLab is that the world can't. Now, these days you can actually make GitHub repositories that are private, okay, without having to pay money. I pay money so I can make large numbers of GitHub repositories of mine private, but without having to do that. You never used to be able to, which was a reason why I used to recommend Bitbucket as another way of doing things. Bitbucket is another Git repository. It works the same way, but it used to have the advantage that you did have some private repository possibilities without having to pay any money. But I now know that the GitHub repository will allow you to do some private work. I don't know what the restriction is, because as I say, I use a paid for one, so I can do all sorts of stuff. Right. Now, I have no idea what Git stands for. I don't think it actually stands for anything apart from an unpleasant person of some sort. But it's got a set of documentation, and there is a nice web space that you can go to find the documentation. And the documentation holds true for GitLab, GitHub, and Bitbucket. As I say, I prefer the layout on GitHub, so I stick with GitHub. But also, I now begin to love the desktop version of GitHub, right? And I discovered that my GitHub, my Git desktop was out of date on this computer today. So I loaded up the latest version, and this is the Microsoft Windows type version of GitHub's desktop. Okay, and I found recently that this works really efficiently. The best thing about it is you don't have to fiddle around setting up SSH keys. If you use this, it sets it all up for you, and it's really quite good at collecting your changes, doing stuff like that. So I'm really quite sold on GitHub at the moment. One of the reasons I've become a bit more sold on GitHub is that the other system I like using, which is sorry, that's not what I wanted to put up. This one, which is GitKraken, has stopped working nicely on my machine at times, and so I'm getting difficulty pushing some stuff. So what I did was to install GitHub desktop on my machine, and instead of using GitKraken, I used GitHub again. I used to also run this class using the PoshGit, and I think I mentioned that in these slides. Yes, here. I used PoshGit in the past. That meant I could show off the fact that I do know some Unix command type structures and know how to use that. And I can do command line stuff. And there is often possibility of overcoming some errors in command line that you might make that isn't so easy to do in any of the more sophisticated Windows type approaches. But if you're an experienced Unix type, so Linux or any of the versions of Linux, you might want to just use Git Bash or one of those and link it all up, set up your command, your SSH keys, and do all sorts of stuff. I've got some notes here, which if you download the notes from the Moodle, we'll talk about doing it using the PoshGit and doing the commands. I've got the slides are on here. I'm going to go past them. So these are what you have to do. You can see the fiddling around you need to do. You need to create an SSH key. You need to copy the key. You need to go to your GitHub page or your GitLab page. You need to tell it what your SSH key is, and then you need to store it. And yeah. So if you don't, then if you've got Git for Windows or Git for Mac on your machine, so if you're a Mac person, you won't want GitHub for Windows, will you? But there is a Git for Mac as well that you can get, which is basically GitHub for Mac. It works the same way, looks, I believe, pretty identical, and I'm sure it works. So if you don't, then when you go to clone your repository from the online version, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, you can just open in desktop. That's a command. I don't know, can you see that down here? If I make this bigger, you'll not be able to see the rest of the stuff. Don't be a nuisance. What have you done now? Come back. What are you doing? Okay, it's too much now. That's the problem. Okay, where was I? I had a little picture here. No, not here. Dum 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 dum. Down here. Move that to the middle of the screen. Oh, sure, you want to see me? Down here it says open in desktop. If you click that, it will run the desktop thing and clone it, and you don't have to go on and do all that SSH stuff. Okay? So, back Git shell, forget about the Git shell stuff. And what I want to talk about now is actually starting up a new project, right? So you can read the notes, I'm sure. When you come to them. This is my, this is the work I did earlier. I've got a single commit that's been pushed for the project I did earlier. I'm going to do it all over again now, right? So what I'm going to start with is a Trello board. Now, I signed up for Trello this morning using a new email address so that I could start all over again, and you wouldn't have to see the many hundreds of boards which I currently have on Trello for the many hundreds of projects I've been involved with, but you can see just one. So I'm making, instead of doing the project that we started to talk about last week with the thing, which you're going to do in the lab, yes, the lab sheet describes, I thought I'd start a new one. And so I started a project which I've called Poles and Ladders. And what I did was to set up a Trello board for poles and ladders. And before I did anything else, I started to make a backlog. Well, when I make a new Trello board, I like to have a backlog a doing and a done list. Yeah? Now the backlog, this is describing what we've still got to do for our project. So when you're starting a new project, so by next Friday, not this Friday, but next Friday, you should have a decently long backlog of product that you need to produce as a group. Yeah? You can do it on Trello. It's trello.com, and you sign up if you haven't already got a Trello account. It's very easy to sign up, and you don't have to pay any money or anything, and you can do all sorts of stuff with it. So you start with your backlog, and my backlog had a thing that said making a 2D game. And I called my... You can't see this, can you? Is this? Yay. So I called this, make a version of a 2D game called Poles and Ladders. Now, Poles and Ladders is actually going to be like Snakes and Ladders. The reason do you know Snakes and Ladders? Yes? Anybody not know the game Snakes and Ladders? It's okay, you can not know it. It can well be a culturally UK game. So let me see if I do this. I don't know if I've got enough light on here you're going to be able to see. In Snakes and Ladders you have a board which has squares on it. These squares are all numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and my board goes up to 80, but okay. And on the board at different places there are ladders which go up, and there are snakes which go down. And the game works by, you throw a dice, right? So that's one thing I've got to produce is a dice, and I've got to do it in such a way that it's random, yeah? And do you throw one dice or two dice? One? Yeah, one. So you can move by up to 6, but you can get, if you get a 6, you get a second throw, right? So these are rules. So you get a counter, and a counter is a round disc, yes? Usually made of plastic. These days, when I was a boy, they were made of metal. Long time ago. So if you threw a 4, you would end up here. But if you threw a 3, you would end up here. Okay? Now, sometime later, and you make your way backwards and forwards, zigzag up the board, you might end up on this snake. And if you end up on this snake, it's sad, you have to come all the way back down here. Right? Now, I called mine Poles and Ladders because I want to do graphics for it, and graphics for snakes are going to be more difficult than graphics for poles. Okay? If I have a pole, it's going to be fairly easy to draw. Yeah? So I can do poles. Ladders aren't too difficult to draw. And within Unity, you can rotate ladders, so I can create random arrangements of things. My poles can do a random arrangement of things. What I've thought of is I'm eventually going to do animations. So my player character, if it gets to the bottom of a pole, then I'm going to animate it sliding up to the top, okay, of the pole. Poles can be different lengths. They don't have to be enormous. They can be, and they don't have to go vertically only. They could go, obviously you wouldn't want a pole coming to the start on the end of another one, because that's like, maybe you would. Okay, so that's the game I'm thinking of making, right? Back off there. So I come up with a backlog. The first thing I've got is a 2D game, and then I'll close that. I've got make a square left now. Actually, I did have more things. Let me zoom out again a bit. I had, this morning, I had create a board as one of my tasks, and I pulled it from here into doing. And at the same time, I assigned it to one of my team members. And as I'm the only person in the team, guess who got the job? Yeah, me, okay? So I got the job, assigned it to me. Now, you will be in a team, so you'll be able to assign different jobs to different people at the same time. So they should be different people doing things. Yes? You got the idea? Right, so I was going to do that. The next thing I have to do is make a square. Now, let me Control-Shift+ again. So a square will have a number and a type. Okay, every square is going to have a type and a number. If the square is the start of a ladder and somebody lands in the square, then that's going to start the animation of the thing sliding up, yeah, and stuff like that. If the square is the top of a pole, then that's going to start the animation of the thing coming down. If the thing is the final square, then that's going to declare the person or counter that's got their non-player character or player character as the winner. So those are all the things that a square could do. But they're all common, so they're an object type thing. It's got an activity, yeah? And different squares have different activity possibilities. So that's my next job that I'm going to have to do. So here we go, make a square, drag it across to the doing pile, and assign a member to that to do that, and as there's still only me, I'm assigning myself again, right? So this now says I will make that square. Right. Now, along with that, I made I set up a GitHub repository for this. You may want to make a project and do all of your Trello board and stuff like that inside GitHub. That's another way to do it. You're going to decide that as a team. But I'm using this because I wanted to be able to show you Trello in use. So I've got all these things. What I now want to do is to create a new branch. Yeah? And what I'm going to do is create that new branch using the Windows thing here. And if you saw my other video on this, you saw I poked away around for a bit before I found where it was that I meant to do it. Here it is, new branch. And then I can say create a new branch, and the new branch is going to have an issue name. What do I want to do on this branch with the code now that I'm going to be creating now? Can you remember? It wasn't that long ago we looked at the Trello board and said it's create a square, yes? Is it? My questions are too obvious to answer, aren't they? Sorry about that. Okay, so my name for this is going to be create a square. What have I done? S-Q-U-A-R-E. Create a square and create that branch off the master branch. And it's done. And now you will see that what we've got checked out is the create a square branch, not the master branch anymore. Now, because we've not made any changes to it, I can't make any commits. Right, so what I'm going to do now is By the way, the physical space on which this all exists is here, and it's the same space. It looks exactly the same. Yeah? But if I make changes to this, I'm not changing the master. I'm changing this sub-branch that's just mine. So if I want eventually to let other people access this branch for their branches, I really should merge it back into, well, in this case, I've only got the master to merge it back into. I would suggest that you have a development branch which you use until you're sure that your developments are right. But at the moment, I've made the branch off master, and that's the default branch at the moment for making my extra branches off. So it doesn't look like anything's changed. If I were to go in here, the code would look the same. I've got a scene and a board that I made earlier. Okay, but when I make changes here, those changes will only be in that branch. Should I then commit that branch and then check out the master branch again, you won't be able to find any of the changes I made here on your local repository, or it would not appear to be. It's a bit of magic what goes on inside Git that actually controls all this, but it's really very helpful, especially helpful when somebody messes up, and you can do what's called rollback, and that's really helpful. I had somebody as an intern last year, and they were doing really well, and then suddenly they got to the point where they'd made something fail, and we couldn't work out what it was. On the Git repository, we were able to play the blame game, and that told us where they'd made the commit that made everything go wrong. So we were able to roll back to that commit and then what we call cherry pick the changes that we'd had since then, which allowed us to get the new piece of code done, up and working within a few hours, which with any other system, any other approach, I don't know how long it would have taken, but it was really very, very helpful. So that's the repository as it stands now. I'm going to fold that down, and what I'm going to do now is to open the project in Unity, and hopefully it will swing up into a window. So this is how far I've got. You can see up here I've got a main camera, a directional light and a sprite, and the sprite is the board. It's a 2D game, so I set it up as a 2D scene, and what's going to happen is each of these is going to become a square. So the first thing I'm going to do is to create a strange game object, which is an empty game object. Okay, now it's got the name game object. That's what I'm going to change it to is square prototype. Now the reason I call it square prototype is, can you read that? That's much too small, isn't it? The reason I'm going to call it square prototype is that I'm going to clone lots of these, and if I've got 80 squares here, if I made a new one for each one, that would take me lots of time. But what I'm going to do eventually is get the system to instantiate each of the squares and then set up their things, and they can be changed every time if we wanted to. You will want, if you were doing, which you were meant to do for Friday, the game, the targets would be something which would be a prototype, and you would want to make a prototype and then instantiate examples of that prototype target. Yeah. Now, eventually, I'm going to take this square object prototype and I'm going to drag it off here, so it's no longer have it on there. But while I set it up, I'm going to work with it there. It's just easier to do that. Yeah. So at the beginning, I'm going to work with one square prototype, over here, and I'm going to add the components to this. And because it's empty, I can add all sorts of things to it. Those things will be linked to where the square prototype is. So I could put physical shapes onto there if I wanted to. I could put players, I could put other things. And that's something I'm going to do with my pipes. My pipes are going to be prototypes as well. Yeah? And they're going to link two squares together eventually. I'm having fun making this game. I usually do. Anybody, any team making a Pipes and Ladders game as their game for their project, for their coursework, they will automatically fail, right? Because I'm claiming IP over this game, right? Limited IP. I have to admit, it is a fairly long existing previous game, but don't make this game. Make a game of your own, right? So, what I want to add to this is actually a new script, which is going to be called a square. Okay, and I can create and add that script, and I can edit that script. And if I double click on here, it will eventually start to load, and I think it will be Visual Studio 2.13 that will start to load, which is a bit of a pain. Oh no, it's mono-develop. Great. Usually if I say it's going to be mono-develop, it turns out to be Visual Studio, and if I say it's Visual Studio, it turns out to be mono-develop. So that's just a this is an integrated development environment that works with Unity. Visual Studio will also work with Unity. It's just a standard mono behavior. The major thing I'm going to give it is its actual characteristics. Yeah? So it's going to have an integer which is its number. Yeah? That will be one of its characteristics. Now, as I haven't got much longer and some people are already leaving, that's the only thing I'm going to do to this at the moment, because I'm not really talking about developing this game at the moment. I will do this at home when I've got more time. Maybe I'll do some work on it in the evenings. But once I've done that, I can now save the file, and you'll find there it's got a number, and I can give it a number here, or I can instantiate it inside the program on start. I might actually want an object that instantiates these and sends a number to these every time it starts. Yeah, so I might instantiate them all gradually. Okay, now I've done that. I'm saved the scene, and because of things that happen in the background, I'm also going to say save the project, just in case anything got created that I wasn't aware of. Okay, back on Git for Windows, it's found some changes. So I'm just going to say what I did. Now this should make sense to everybody else who's going to use the system. Now you may not be able to read this at the moment from where you are. I'm going to say it, but it will be in the video, which will go onto the Moodle page as soon as Gail gets home tonight. Right, or gets free tonight. So what I'm going to call it is added a square prototype. And I'm going to put in a description so far the prototype just has a class which holds the square number. Pretty useless, but that's what it does. I commit this, and now on here I can just publish the branch. If you want to use Git for GitHub, Posh Git, there's all sorts of things you can do. You say add star and commit -m, and you put in your message, and then you put push git push blah blah. It's easy to do if you're an experienced Linux programmer or Unix programmer, but this one's pretty simple to use and works, and it's made the changes. If we go back to the online version and refresh the page, you'll see now that it's got create a square as a method, and inside here it's got the change that I've got in the assets, which is the square CS in there, and the changes are all recorded up there. So that's all we've got time for today. If you have any questions, please let me know. Hopefully that was fairly easy to follow. It's apparently 18 minutes for me to get home by car. My phone has just told me. So, hope you have a nice evening. See you sometime soon.